Myostatin. Could blocking it be the key to maintaining muscle size and strength after an injury or in the later stages of a dog's life? It might be possible, but it won't be simple. So, what is myostatin anyway? Myostatin is a protein that limits muscle growth and muscle mass. So basically, myostatin puts the brakes on muscle growth in the body. In a 2007 study, inhibiting myostatin in mice led to a significant increase in muscle size. So this isn't surprising, and you might have seen some of the photos of very large muscular mice going around for quite a while, and these are a lot of the mice from the study. But while their muscles got larger, they didn't actually get stronger, and their tendons actually got weaker. So it's important for tendons to be strong. It's actually important for tendons to be flexible as well, because they have to transmit force from muscle to bone, and then they have to do it over and over and over again throughout the dog's life. The tendons also store elastic energy, so they act like a spring, and then they release that energy during movement. So the tendons of the myostatin deficient mice were actually 14 times stiffer. So if you think about some of the dog's tendons, like say their Achilles, you can imagine if it was 14 times stiffer when they're running on it and they're trying to explode forward with it, you can imagine how that would be extremely problematic if that were to happen. So the tendons of the mice were smaller, they were brittle, and they were weaker. So for example, the Achilles tendon in the mice actually was 44% smaller. So it wasn't just a little bit smaller, it was actually a lot smaller. And again, these were the mice with the larger muscles. So what exactly does that tell us from this study? It tells us that myostatin plays a critical role in much more than just regulating muscle size. So myostatin actually seems to be important for tendon maintenance, based on this study. In another study from 2006, also on mice, they found the mice that had reduced myostatin levels had larger muscles, but their muscles actually had fewer mitochondria. So, meaning like the muscles couldn't actually produce as much energy in these myostatin deficient mice. So they had bigger muscles, but they had less energy. So as you can imagine, this led to a reduced force output for the muscles, because again, they had less energy to do so. So an increase in muscle mass did not result in a proportional gain in muscle strength. So again, that means these muscles generated less force for their size. So there's actually a type of cattle called a Belgian Blue. And again, you might have seen these cattle going around because they look extremely humongous. They're very, very muscular. And it's actually a natural mutation that's occurred. And these cattle naturally have less myostatin than other cattle. So while they have these really huge muscles, they're actually prone to muscle damage after even only mild exercise. And one of the reasons for this is because their lack of myostatin predisposes them to having a lot of type 2B fibers. So those are like the very explosive fibers that are good for like very short explosive activity. And so these fibers fatigue very quickly, then making them prone to muscle damage after they fatigue. And these cattle have a very high degree of these fibers. So you can see how they could lead to a higher rate of injury and muscle damage. So another more recent study from 2013 looked at the musculotendinous junction. So the musculotendinous junction is where the muscles and tendons meet, so where the muscle and tendons come together, and where the force is then transferred from the muscle into the tendon and then into the bone. So myostatin seemed to affect the shape of the nuclei in the cells in the myotendinous junction, which might seem irrelevant or confusing or not useful, but actually the shape of the nucleus affects how genes are accessed and how proteins are produced inside the cell. So basically what that means, by altering the shape of the nucleus, myostatin affected the production of proteins that help maintain strength and integrity in the myotendinous junction, especially during the initial stages of growth and wound healing. So basically by reducing myostatin, it actually made this really critical junction in the body, the myotendinous junction, less able to grow and heal. So similar to the mice with the more brittle tendons, it's putting them at, put them at much higher risk for injury. So we looked at 3 studies there, and that's given us a pretty good idea that blocking myostatin in mice, at least at this point, doesn't seem to be a very good idea. But do other animals react the same way? And so in 2015, researchers modified a rat's genes to reduce myostatin. So these rats without myostatin became more muscular, but they actually didn't become as muscular as the mice did. And unlike the mice, they actually became stronger, and their tendons did not become smaller. So, which also makes sense as to why they could be stronger. They're actually able to transmit that force. So their research actually suggested that myostatin works to reduce muscle size, not by inducing atrophy, but by blocking hypertrophy. So that can be relevant, especially when people are looking at potentially blocking myostatin using different supplements in the future. The myostatin is not actually inducing atrophy, right? It's just actually limiting hypertrophy, at least based on the evidence from this study. So this study is probably a little bit more relevant as well to dogs. Rats are larger than mice, and so their muscular structure and fiber is a little bit more similar. It's definitely more similar to humans. So that study seems a little bit more promising than the mice studies. But there are some studies on dogs that we can actually look at. So there's a type of dog, which is actually a variation on a whippet. So it's still a pure breed whippet, but it has a naturally occurring myostatin deficiency. Again, you might have seen the picture of these dogs going around. They're pretty noteworthy. So some of these dogs have a modification of this myostatin gene. So the dogs that have 2 copies of this gene or a homozygous mutation are called bully whippets. So these are the dogs that you might have seen that are really, really muscular. A 2007 study looked at their muscle mass and racing performance in these dogs. And so they found that another variation of these dogs, which essentially has 1 copy of this gene, so it's a heterozygous carrier, was the fastest, right? So the dogs that had myostatin partially blocked, but not completely blocked, were the fastest. So they had more muscle to be faster than the average whippet, but not as much as the bully whippets, to the extent that it actually hindered their speed. This mutation hasn't been seen in other dog breeds, even dogs that are closely related to whippets. The whippets that have this mutation don't seem to have any other health issues, despite the fact that they have increased rates of muscle cramping. The bully whippets do often have an overbite. I think about half of them have an overbite, but it's not really known if that's a result of the myostatin deficiency or not. So these dogs definitely functioned a lot better than some of the other animals in the studies we've looked at, particularly the mice. So it may be that being born without myostatin is an advantage compared to having it modified like later in life. But we have some other studies to look at that'll look at blocking myostatin from birth. So in 2016, there was another study that actually took these heterozygous carrier whippets, so the whippets that had myostatin partially blocked and were the fastest from those trials. They took those dogs and they bred them with what's called GRMD dogs. So GRMD dogs are dogs that suffer from something called golden retriever muscular dystrophy. So this is a type of muscular dystrophy that's really similar to Duchenne's. So it's often used as a model in clinical research because of that similarity. And basically, either one of these disorders is a genetic disorder that causes progressive muscle weakness and muscle wasting. So when they bred these two dogs together, the heterozygous carriers, whippets, and the GRMD dogs, they found that the resulting offspring were actually much worse off than just the plain GRMD dogs. They called these resulting dogs grippets. And essentially some of their muscles grew, but not all. So when they blocked myostatin in these dogs, essentially that caused some of their muscles to grow better, but not all of them. So some muscles like the sartorius on like the cranial front side of their thigh grew pretty big. And other muscles like their gastrocnemius basically atrophied away. So these dogs had really significant muscle imbalances, which led them to have really poor range of motion. So they struggled to walk because they couldn't move their legs. Their tongue also grew really large, which made it really difficult for them to eat. So clearly in this study, blocking myostatin even from birth had pretty unexpected health consequences that did not work out well at all. In 2011, they looked in another group of GRMD dogs to see if they could treat this condition in a very different way. So they actually engineered a virus that goes to the liver and programs the liver to make a molecule that blocks myostatin in the body. And then the liver continues to make this and, again, keep blocking myostatin for years. So this is pretty efficient because this isn't a drug you have to continually take. And it's actually pretty effective. So they found the dogs treated in this way had 30% lower levels of creatine kinase, which creatine kinase is what's measured to assess muscle damage. So these dogs had significantly less muscle damage as a result of the liver making something that can block myostatin in the body. And these dogs also saw a 25% increase in body weight, which is a pretty huge amount. And most of this was actually lean muscle. So based on this study, it seems actually pretty promising that you may be able to block myostatin and help animals that are suffering from some form of muscle wasting, at least in some sort of muscular dystrophy based on this study, but obviously potentially in other conditions as well that would affect muscle loss and wasting and weakness. So we've looked at that a little bit, but what about blocking myostatin in healthy animals? In a 2004 study, they looked at that, and they found that myostatin levels were not always correlated with muscle mass. So basically, what they said is they found a low correlation between serum myostatin and muscle mass. So the level of the dog's myostatin, how much myostatin they had in their blood, didn't really affect how much muscle mass they had. They found that athletic activities, so how the dogs trained, a lot of these dogs did fitness, for example, and the diet they ate, both of those things, so how much they worked out, what they ate, affected muscle mass development, but it didn't actually affect serum myostatin. As the animals aged, they found that myostatin decreased as they aged. And that's thought to compensate for age-related muscle loss. But there were no differences between sex, reproductive status, the dog's breed, sport practice, nutrition. So basically, the level of myostatin in their blood was only related to age. And the myostatin naturally decreased as they aged. Probably, again, to help with a lot of the age-related muscle loss that happens in older animals. So based on this study, you might wonder if blocking myostatin would actually lead to more muscle mass. because clearly it's not always correlated together. At least a dog working out and eating a certain diet to have more muscle mass doesn't necessarily have less myostatin. But that doesn't necessarily mean that reducing myostatin wouldn't increase muscle mass either. So basically, what have we learned? We've learned that blocking myostatin can definitely lead to unexpected consequences, often pretty poor consequences. However, there is some promising research that suggests that blocking or limiting myostatin may lead to better strength and mobility and muscle mass in older animals, or injured animals, or animals suffering from some sort of disease that impacts muscle development or maintenance. In a future video, we are going to look at and investigate substances that may block, especially kind of mildly block myostatin, and that could be beneficial to older or injured animals to help them be able to live stronger, fitter, healthier lives for much longer. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.